time now that we've started kind of wonky, so I know when to end. Are we thinking 6:15, 7:15, about 7:45, done with the presentation, and then some questions for a little bit?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, perfect. So I'm Sharron Donnelly. I'm going to actually hide you guys and hide me. I am the owner of Advanced Pediatric Therapies. Actually, since it's small, I like looking at you. I'm going to open you guys back up. I am the owner of Advanced Pediatric Therapies. We have clinics in Portland, Oregon, and then one here in Vancouver, Washington. And we opened in 2002. And so we've been doing mostly focusing on sensory processing for 18 years now. Right now, we've had to switch into telehealth. So this is a very familiar platform to me. And actually, that's something that we can talk about at some point too. There's been some brilliant things that have happened as a result of telehealth. Some things that I wouldn't have thought would come out as a positive benefit of it have really shown. Parent education, parent training has been remarkable, and parents having to be the catalyst for working with a child at home sometimes has been overwhelming to some, but the most feedback I get is that it's been a great opportunity to have to figure out what to do at the house, and that's been really fun. So, but the whole thing has been stressful, as it probably has for all of you. I am glad that I'm able to do this presentation in this platform, Brenda, so thank you for thinking about that.
Of course.
So let's get started. Of course, now my mouse doesn't want to work. Maybe it's just being slow. These are my children. So on the left is my son who's upside down. He's a gymnast. And in the middle, that's the same son. And then the one on the right is my little boy, Jakey. He's a hockey player. These boys were adopted at birth. So we do have a semi-open adoption. We do talk to their parents every now and then. They have taught me more about sensory processing, learning difficulties than my, I guess, years prior to them. As all of you as parents know, that our children are our biggest teachers. Joey, who has asked me not to talk about him anymore now that he is almost 13. So, but I do, and I will. He is anxious. He's an anxious little guy. His anxiety doesn't show up like a meek little mouse. It shows up like a raging tiger. It's better now that he's older, but as a child, my husband used to say whenever we were out in public, he's really bad for business. You know, here I am supposed to be a therapist working with kids, and here's my son misbehaving. But so he found gymnastics early on. Actually, he found it, we found it for him. People say, how did he get into gymnastics? And Joey was always on his head. That picture of him upside down, I have 5 million of those. He is always upside down. He's always flipping. He's never sitting still. Again, some of this has gotten better as he's gotten older, but that's how he got into gymnastics. And the other guy, Jakey, he is my happy-go-lucky little boy, but he has dyslexia. So, and 3rd grade has been a beast for him. He thinks that homeschooling was his gift, his prayers being answered, because he was not having a good 3rd grade year. So these are my little guys, and you will hear me mention them throughout the course. You know, it's a small community. If you do meet them or know someone who knows them, Joey has asked for his privacy. I have tried. I cannot stop talking about them. So anyway, the goals today are going to help you understand how sensory processing or sensory integration impacts attention, behavior, learning, and social engagement, to look at what dysfunction in the sensory systems look like. And in doing that, we're also going to look at what does typical sensory processing look like what is the job of that sensory system, and what does it look like if that sensory system is not performing its job adequately. Then we're going to talk about how to develop specific tools and strategies to work with your children in your life, both personally and then professionally. And already I've learned that a lot of you have dual roles. Have any of you heard me speak before besides Brenda? Okay. What I like to do when I do this presentation is, and I should preface it by saying I can do this presentation in 2 hours. I can do it in 6 hours. I've learned I cannot do it in less than 2 hours. I could do it in 2 days. And at different points, there's different places I could branch off and do another 2 days. So this is kind of going to be like the speed dial of sensory processing disorder. And I know what you really want are tools and strategies. And what I've learned through the years of doing this presentation, or presentations similar to this, is that I find it's very empowering to help you learn to be a detective and identify what your child's behavior is trying to tell them. And in doing that, what we have to do in the first part of this course is go through like nuts and bolts of sensory integration. So like, what are the sensory systems? What does the vestibular system mean? What is the job of that sensory system? And then by knowing that, we'll talk about what dysfunction looks like. And then you'll have the tools to be able to create a sensory diet for your child. If I were to just say, hey, put your child on a swing and swing them 10 times. So one of you would be like, oh yeah, my child totally digs the swing. That would be great. And another one would be like, ooh, my child does not like the swing. So I'm going to help you be a detective around what your child's behavior has been trying to tell you as far as what their sensory needs are. So to empower you to create that sensory program for them. I believe that there's no greater feeling than being understood. And what I love, love, love most about my job is helping parents to get the connection with their children, and a real strong connection where they have this mutually engaged and protective and nurturing relationship. And I think that sometimes with children who are difficult, that's really, really hard because we don't understand their behavior, and their behavior is coming across as defiant or oppositional or just quite challenging. And what I hope to do today is to give you a sense of what that behavior is trying to tell you, so that you can understand where that behavior is coming from, so that you can view that child's behavior as a need for a sensory stimulation or trying to avoid a sensory stimulation versus like being willfully defiant or oppositional or whatever it is that is causing you grief. The behavior has all behavior has meaning, and typically that child's behavior is trying to tell you one of four things. They're either trying to get some attention, they're trying to meet a sensory need, they're trying to avoid a sensory stimuli, or they're trying to get something tangible. And so the presentation today will help you to identify what are your child's sensory needs and what have they been trying to tell you. I love this graphic. What it's basically saying is that children's brains develop from the bottom up. So they develop from the brainstem into the more emotional brain as the second level, and then the cortical brain is the third level. So the ability to think and learn and reason and inhibit is actually tertiary. So that's the third level to develop. The first level to develop is actually sensory motor systems. And so you can see already, just even from this graphic, that if your child is having trouble processing sensory information, or if sensory information is not coming to them appropriately, it's going to cause difficulties with attachment and emotional development. It's going to cause difficulties with thinking and learning and language and inhibiting. So it's really important for us to be working on those sensory systems. I have another way of showing that in just a second. So sensory processing is the organization of sensation for use. My guess is that most of you already knew that definition. We are bombarded by billions and billions of pieces of sensory information at any one time. So I'm working from home. I just heard my dog outside barking. I can see the flash of the light coming in from the sun. It's 6 o'clock. I had to snarf down a dinner so that I wouldn't be hungry when I was teaching. So I'm, my interoceptive, all these things. I've been on Zoom all day, so I've been sitting. So my need for movement, all of this stuff is coming to me at any one time. And the nervous system's job then is to say, okay, this is important. You need to pay attention to that. This is not important. You don't need to pay attention to that. And to decide what's relevant to us. And what's relevant to me might be not relevant to you. But the point is, we're bombarded by millions and millions and billions of pieces of information. And the nervous system's job is to detect what's important for use. What happens for some of our kids is all that information is coming in, and all of it is being presented as relevant. So the nervous system is not sorting and filtering and organizing that sensory information, and everything is basically overwhelming the child. Or the child might be an under register, and the information comes in, but it's almost not enough to get the nervous system up and ready to engage or to interpret that information. So some of you, if you've been around for a while, have heard of sensory integration disorder. And I think maybe it's more common now, like in the last, it's probably been 10 years now, the more common word is sensory processing disorder. So sometimes, because I come from way back, I'll use sensory integration disorder. In this presentation, I'll try to use sensory processing disorder, but they're interchangeable for the purposes of this presentation. Sensory processing disorder occurs when sensory signals are either not detected by the brain, or they don't get organized into appropriate responses. And we'll talk about what that means. The common symptoms you'll see of a sensory processing disorder are overly sensitive to touch, movement, sights, or sounds, On the other hand, and I think that's what most people know when they think about sensory processing disorder, is more of that sensitivity. On the other hand, you can have kids who are underreactive to sensory stimulation. So they need more to get the input. Their activity levels can be unusually high or unusually low. They might have coordination problems, might have delays in language, motor skills, or academic achievement, impulsive, distractible, poor organization. And some of you talked about having older kids. At a younger child, it might just look like body organization or ability to move from one place to the next, or the room might be a little messy. By middle school, it's usually the kid who can't organize to get their homework in, or their desk is really messy, or their locker's really messy. They're the ones who, as they have to transition to the next class, their friends are saying, come on, Juliet, it's time to go, and helping them to try to get organized. When left untreated, sensory processing disorder can affect self-esteem and your self-concept. Decrease in self-regulation, we see that a lot with kids with sensory processing disorder. And then difficulty engaging in occupations across environment. And that's what an occupational therapist does. So I'm an OT. And what is the job of an occupational therapist? Well, it's to help kids engage in their occupation. So what is a child's occupation? Well, a child's occupation is play, chores, schoolwork, and all those activities of daily living. So basically, I play all day. Things to know is that sensory processing disorder affects about 1 in 20. There is a higher prevalence in gifted children. And it surprises me, a lot of people still don't know that in gifted children, or what used to be called tag children, there's a higher prevalence actually of sensory processing disorder. There's actually a diagnosis called 2E, or twice exceptional, that some of you might know about, that really talks about the difficulty that kids who are gifted have with sort of processing sensory information or other things that come comorbid with being gifted. There's a higher prevalence with kids with ADHD, with autism, and with Fragile X. They're finding that there actually is a difference in the physiology of children with sensory processing disorder and children who are developing typically, which is great, because part of the reason that sensory processing disorder is still not as recognized as I would love it to be is that there's no clear markings, or there were no findings of clear markings that would separate sensory processing disorder from ADHD. And so, or from kids who are typically developing. And there's a researcher out of UCSF, University of California, San Francisco. Her name is Alyssa Marcos. And I think there's a slide here next. And she's a pediatric neurologist, and she's been doing a ton of looking at neuroimaging and really beginning to see that the brains actually look different in children with sensory processing disorder and children with autism, which is great, because a lot of times people will think that because you have sensory processing disorder, you have autism, but that's not necessarily true. You can have sensory processing disorder and not have autism. Now, on the new diagnostic criteria of autism, you have to have sensory processing disorder, but it is not the converse. I did see a chat come in. I'll get to it in just 1 second. Occupational therapy is an effective intervention for treating symptoms of sensory processing disorder, and that OTs are currently increasing the research around that. I'll finish this slide. So that's the Alyssa Marco. There's a podcast that she does that's really good. And then I really liked kind of talking about the neurology and looking at the imaging. What they found is that there's a decreased connectivity in white matter of children with SPD, but that's not true in children with mild ASD. So again, really finding that there is a difference in neuroimaging there, which is good to kind of have more clarity on the two. What we hear a lot is it sensory processing disorder, or is it ADHD? And what we'll see is it's almost like a Venn diagram where you'll see ADHD, sensory processing disorder, and then sometimes you see it overlapping. It's funny, when the chat comes in, it pops up, but then after a few minutes, the chat is gone and I don't know how to get to it.
Oh, I just asked, it's more common in children or people with Down syndrome too, isn't it, or not?
Yes, so basically when I say Fragile X too, I should say genetic syndromes. Okay, thank you.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, sensory processing, and like once you reach middle school, and how it's like the whole, you can't get organized, you can't cut up. What's the difference between that and like executive dysfunction then?
Yeah, so that's a great question too, right? So, and that's a very, very good question. So what we do a lot is try to see if we put the right sensory supports in place. If we can give the child the right sensory supports, is that enough to help with their ability to more focus and be attentive, to get organized and do the things that they need to do? Or is there an underlying executive functioning difficulty? So we are often referring out to psychologists to do some more executive functioning tests. Oftentimes with sensory processing disorder, if we put the right supports in place, then they're off and running, and that's all they needed. You can imagine how sensory processing disorder could affect executive functioning. I mean, think about impulsivity. So if you're trying to avoid a stimuli or get a stimuli, you might appear impulsive. Attention, if you are distracted by a bunch of sensory information, you're going to appear inattentive. So if we put the right supports in place, if it's a sensory processing disorder, standing alone, then hopefully that's enough to meet those needs. But yeah, sometimes we do have to look at, is there more of an executive functioning disorder, ADHD, that sort of thing. Yeah, it's tricky. We're seeing a lot of kids. I think our biggest thing we see now coming into the clinic that's not more like a classic sensory integration or sensory processing disorder is kids who are presenting with a ton of anxiety. And we're getting those kids from psychologists or mental health workers because they want to see about that mind-body connection. And if we can get them embodied, then with that and help them process sensory information, does that decrease their anxiety? So we're seeing that a lot. And a lot of times it's working hand in hand with that professional.
And we did get something like that in the chat box, somebody commenting that it may be also some of mental health issues too.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, it's interesting being a kind of a boutique, if you will, in sensory processing disorder. We don't have a psychologist that works on staff for us. We used to have a counselor that worked with us, but we're constantly referring out to psychologists or social workers or the like when we have been treating a child for a period of time and we either reached a plateau or we're not achieving the goals that we need to achieve, because what else is standing in the way? I like this graph too, this triangle. Oh, I meant to change it out for you guys. I'll tell you what the change would be, and then I will write myself a note to make the change. Earlier when I showed you that diagram from the Beacon House, and I talked about how the brainstem develops first, and then the midbrain, and then the higher brain. This triangle is very similar to that, where if you think about this being a triangle of development, and some of you I think are educators, if you think about Piaget's theory of development from an educational perspective, the bottom layer lays the foundation for everything at the top. From a sensory perspective, occupational therapist perspective, the sensory systems lay the foundation for all future learning, for sensory motor integration, for perceptual motor skills, for cognitive skills. And actually, the diagram that has now been made has it inverted, and then has relationship coming at it from the sides. And I think that's super important because we can affect all those through relationship. But what we're going to do here in a second is talk about this bottom layer, these sensory systems, and kind of to go through those sensory systems, particularly the powerhouse systems, like the tactile, vestibular, proprioceptive, auditory. We'll talk a lot about those, what they are, what the system's job is, what dysfunction looks like. And what you can see here is that, you know, if you have a child, in fact, you know, some of you were describing your children earlier, and they have a difficulty with behavior, or they have a difficulties with handwriting, or they have difficulty with tying their shoes beyond an age where it could be appropriate, or riding a bike. What I would do then is look at what are the systems that contribute to that? Like, what do I know about riding a bike? Well, I know that you have to have posture, and you have to be able to sit upright. You have to be able to use both sides of your body. You have to have visual spatial awareness. So my evaluation is actually going to be down here. So I'm going to do the evaluation down here to see where the gaps in development are and see where we need to kind of shore up so that development develops the way that it should. What we see a lot of times is that kids might be great academic learners. They have great scores academically, high achievers, might have great eye-hand coordination, but might have poor motor planning or poor awareness of two sides of their body. So what we see a lot is like Swiss cheese in development. So it's like someone needs to come in and fill in the holes so there's not this Swiss cheese in development. So our evaluation will be down here, and we're going to look at the vestibular, proprioceptive, tactile, the sensory systems to help us figure out, based on what the parents' concerns are, why they might be having difficulties in those areas. So to go through those systems, any questions before I go through the systems? No? Okay. The proprioceptive system has receptors in the muscles and joints. It gives us our awareness of our body position. It's activated by active movement and best with resistance. The function of the proprioceptive system is to give information to your brain about where your body parts are without having to think about it or having to look at it. It's like me saying to you, Brenda, I know your name. So I'm gonna say, you know, Brenda, without even, close your eyes and tell me where your left arm is. You don't have to answer that. But without even thinking about it, you would know my left arm is resting on my right arm. It's laying on my desk. Like you wouldn't have to think about any of that. When you go up the stairs at your house, you don't have to think anymore about how high you're going to lift your leg. When you walk through a door, you don't have to think about the spatial between your body and the door. Your proprioceptive system is giving you enough information that you just know that on a subconscious level. The proprioceptive system allows us to grade the appropriate force or pressure in our activities. So it's like me, I took my first trip to Starbucks yesterday. Yes, this is yesterday's cup. I'm still holding on to it because it was my first trip back. I got an iced tea. And actually, if you haven't been to Starbucks lately, I guess they pass it to you in a cup, like in a mug, so you don't have to touch hands. I actually thought I was getting a gift for not going back, not being there in so long. I was like, oh, I get a cup? And she's like, no, that's how we're passing it. I was like, oh, I thought it's because I hadn't been here in so long. But if this cup is full, I don't think about it. I just grab the cup and, you know, do my thing. As it gets more empty, I might change my pressure and use less pressure versus, oh, this water I have over here is in a glass cup. It's heavier. I have to hold it tighter. I had to lift it with more strength than I do this one, but I never thought about it. Never once did I think about it. So if you have poor proprioceptive awareness, what you might do is either have to look at things as you're lifting or doing, or you might not, and then you might misstep. You might use too much pressure when you're writing on a pencil because you don't have the proprioceptive awareness. You might use too little pressure when you're writing with a pencil because, again, you don't have the proprioceptive awareness. When you go to give your friends a hug or to say hello in the morning to your classmates, if you don't have that proprioceptive awareness, you might give too big of a hug, too deep of a hug. You might actually bump into them and knock them over because you didn't have the awareness of where to stop, the proprioceptive joint muscle awareness that says, here you are, here you are. So that proprioceptive system is very important in our ability to grade force. What we see a lot with kids with sensory processing disorder, if they're under registering or needing more information, they might be proprioceptive seekers, if you will, where we call them our crash and burners. They're the kid who might be on the swing at the clinic and then they don't really want to be on the swing. They want to fall off and crash and get that body input and then get back on and then fall off and crash. It's been real fun to see kids in their house. Like, are they the kid that might go under the cushions and say, Mom, squish me, squish me? Are they the kid that loves a bunch of, you know, deep pressure input and deep big bear hugs? I saw there was a chat there.
I just found in my very own life, but yesterday I was wearing a mask and I totally ran into a chair. And I'm like, I've walked by that chair, right? 1,700 times, but it was in my peripheral, so I judged it differently with this mask on. And so I'm wondering how that affects, right?
You know, I don't know. I heard something else like that recently. Someone had put on Facebook that they had to remove their mask to do something you wouldn't think you needed to remove your mask for, right? Like it was something to hear maybe. And I think it's just, hopefully we'll all get kind of used to it, but I think it is just another sensory input that might skew with the amount of input that you are able to interpret at one time for some, especially for kids who are not able to sort and filter and organize that input, or adults, Brenda.
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting. I've heard that before too.
Reminds me of this thing where like it says getting old means turning the car stereo down so you could see better.
Yes, and I do that. Yes, exactly. And that's what someone put about their mask and kind of what Brenda was describing too. So that will be interesting for us to be more aware of. I hadn't thought of that until someone posted it, and then you just said it again. Dysfunction in the proprioceptive system might look again like kids seeking that deep pressure, crashing into people, hard hugs, difficulty standing in line. And think about it, if you're the kid who's constantly crashing into people, either because you don't have that awareness or because you like the input, what might happen if you're, you know, early school age, elementary kid, and you're doing that? What might you get labeled? A bully. You might get labeled a bully because you're constantly bumping into people and crashing into people. These kids can sometimes have postural difficulty. Think about it. If you're not getting the awareness from your joints and muscles about where your joints and muscles are, you are going to be a child who's probably a little more clumsy. You might, if it's really big, you might go to sit down in your chair and fall off your chair. You might have difficulty walking up the stairs or down the stairs without, you know, consciously looking or holding the rail. Or these are kids that beyond an age where it's typical are still using 2 legs on each stair instead of alternating up the stairs. If you are a child, again, who's constantly falling off your chair, typically by 3rd or 4th grade, what might that child do the next time they fell off their chair? They'll probably say they meant to do it. So yeah, they'll become the class clown versus admitting that they had no idea where their body was. It was so cute. I went to a classroom recently to observe this little boy, and all classic signs of sensory processing disorder, very distractible, clumsy. And at one point the kids transitioned from these small groups that they were in back to their chairs. His teacher had put him in the front because he probably needed to be in the front for a little less distraction. But the projector was right behind his desk, so he had a little limited space, and there was a cord. And this child, the class had moved on, and this little boy is trying so hard to figure out how he's going to pull out his chair, how he's going to put his body in it. Kind of got it. And then it was like, oh, that's a total sensory kid, like classic indicators of like not knowing where his body is, right? These children can have difficulty grading force. We just talked about that. If you don't know where your joints and muscles are, you might have difficulty dressing and undressing, even just like make sense with buttons and zippers and snaps. But it could be even with like getting your shirt over your arms, and because you don't really know where your body parts are. These kids can have poor fine and gross motor skills as well. And I say kids, but we're seeing a lot more adults, and a lot more adults are identifying with difficulties with sensory processing disorder. I want to say Anna, someone earlier identified their older child. It might not have been Anna, sorry.
Yeah, no, Anna's is like 8 or 9.
Okay, someone identified that their older child might have sensory processing disorder. And I think that we're seeing that all the time with adults. Parents are saying, oh, that was me. Or because it's more common now, adults are calling and saying, do you treat adults? So I will say children, because that's what this presentation is about, but it could be any individual.
So you do treat adults?
So I will take adults on a case-by-case basis. I usually refer them out to a couple of people who really, that's what they do most often.
Sure.
I have my hands full with kids, but I will sometimes, depending on what my caseload is like at the time.
Sure.
Uh-oh. I got too excited. Okay. Proprioceptive input. And when we think about proprioceptive input, we often think about heavy work. So if your therapist or your teacher, whoever has said, I've been giving them a lot of heavy work, what they're really doing is trying to give them a lot of proprioceptive input. Proprioceptive input will typically last in the nervous system for about 90 minutes. So after about 15 minutes of really good heavy work activities in a typically developing nervous system, it will last about 90 minutes. Now imagine if you're a nervous system that is either under registering or over registering, probably under registering, you're going to need it more often. So these would be kids that are seeking it out continually throughout the day. When we talk about creating sensory diets, we will talk about like how to provide that input more frequently throughout the day so that they're not seeking it out in ways that are inopportune. Active heavy work or active proprioceptive input is going to last longer than passive. So active will be like pushing or pulling or hanging, like things that really are resistive, versus passive, which is where you might like have a kid wear a heavy backpack, or you might have a kid put a weighted sock over their leg, or you might give joint compressions if you've heard of those. That's more passive, and that's not going to last as long or work as quickly as active. So here, one of the more common that you see in the classroom is using a heavy vest or a lap cushion. And typically I will say use those for about 20 minutes because after about that, they're going to habituate to it. So you might wear it for about 20 minutes, then take it off, and then you can put it back on again later. But after about 20 minutes, the nervous system's going to be like, I know what that is, like, and just habituate to it. So you need to take it off, remove it. That's different from a weighted blanket. A weighted blanket, I would not say go take it off them after 15 to 20 minutes. Sometimes what we'll do is have heavy objects or pull bins. So the kids are having to pull heavy objects around the house. So they're getting that input throughout the day. We can teach parents or schools, depending on the age, to do animal walks. I have some pictures of these. Isometric holding activities. We'll often give these kids jobs. So like if I see that Johnny in Mrs. Phelps' class is always on the go and always busy, we might have a system in place at our school where there's this bin of heavy things that goes to the learning support classroom or to the principal. And if that bin is getting carried by someone, then you know that child needed heavy work. You might tell Johnny, hey, Johnny, will you run this errand for me? But you know your intention was really giving them heavy work input. Now, that being said, at a certain age, I like to teach kids what we're doing for them. Hey, buddy, it looks like you need a break. Why don't I have you carry this heavy stuff down to Mrs. LaRose's office or whatever? So we'll give them jobs. Yoga is another really good way of getting proprioceptive input into the nervous systems. Again, sometimes we used to do a group of yoga and self-regulation for 12 to 14-year-old girls. That was pretty cool. Play wrestling is another really good way to get proprioceptive input in. Play wrestling, when you think about it, it's like pushing and pulling and trying to get untrapped. There's a ton of heavy work that comes in with play wrestling. The other thing that's cool with play wrestling is if you study mammal behavior, like if you could Google play wrestling and mammals, and you'll see tons of videos of like apes and animals doing this in the wild, because it's such a great way of seeking engagement and getting that like fun engagement, but then knowing when to freeze and take a break, and then getting it again and getting this fun engagement, and then knowing when to take a break. A lot of time with wrestling at the house, we talk about setting boundaries around it. Stop means stop, go means go. I mean, depending on the family and the kids, you might need to put containers around it and boundaries around it. It's interesting, kids that seek heavy work, sometimes I have actually told parents to do play wrestling prior to bed. Like if you have a child who seeks a ton of input, it's not uncommon that these are kids that also might have trouble falling to sleep or transitioning to sleep. And it's interesting because and some kids will, again, this is the detective work, right? Some kids will need like lower lighting. They might need soft music. They might need the warm bath. They might need the lavender. Other kids, it's like, dude, give me some heavy work, push, pull, jump on me, wrestle with me, get it, to this big energy spot, and then I will calm down. So that's, again, part of the detective work that you might do to see if your child actually needs more input prior to transitioning to more of those quiet times. School moves I'll give you some examples of that. And I think everybody now has heard of Go Noodle. Tons of or maybe I just say that because I've been doing telehealth and it's one of the more popular like movement activities, and teachers are doing it a ton. But there's a lot of movement, heavy work activities in Go Noodle. Here's some pictures of what I was talking about. So the picture of the grocery store is actually a preschool classroom that you can see there's even yellow phone books that have been duct taped, but it's everything's been taken out of those and heavy stuff has been put into them. So when they're playing over there in that section, they're actually getting heavy work input. Here's a picture. Just one of the things I love you guys to start to think about is like, how can I get this input to my child in their daily routine? How can I get that to them when we are sheltered in place and at home, and I, need to get them this input frequently throughout the day so that we can get homework done, energy out when we're not allowed to go outside. And instead of like at 2 o'clock, I'm going to do this, and at 5 o'clock, I'm going to do this, really thinking about everything that you do and what input does it provide. This one's easy, right? This is climbing. So these are kids at a park. That's huge, heavy work, right? This right here is fabric on a ream. You can get it from Joann's. It's just fabric. Literally, I don't sew. I don't know anything about fabric stores, but I go and I just say, can I have fabric on the ream? And they're like, yes. And it's already sewed together and it just creates a tunnel. Think about crawling through that tunnel. If it's tight enough, you're getting a ton of input into your body, right? You're getting a lot of input into your body as far as deep touch pressure. If you're crawling, think about crawling. Crawling is huge, heavy work. So you're getting a ton of proprioceptive input from crawling. This is TheraBand. You can just do stretching and pulling and pushing. Sometimes we'll take little pieces of TheraBand, that purple, and we'll put it around legs of a chair. So when a kid is at school, they have the TheraBand tied around the legs of their chair, and they can just push and pull on the TheraBand. Gives them a lot of heavy work activity through the legs. That's sometimes nice versus putting a kid on a movement ball. For some kids, that gets them more excited, or they can't stay on, but the TheraBand really gives them that deep pressure, heavy work that they need. These are body socks. The kids climb in it and they push and pull against it. But animal walks. If you are working with younger kids, someone said they're a para. If it's appropriate in the classroom, you know, I might have them walk to the door crawling as bears, or in one of the schools that I've been working with here, they used to hop from their class into the music class like bunnies, so, or kangaroos. So they're doing, you know, some hopping as they transition from one place to the next. On the bottom right is something from a program called School Moves. You can find that online. It's different little activities that you can do to increase focus or attention. And it's actually a really good program and very simple to use. Okay, yeah, I'm going to answer questions on proprioceptive before moving on. So, oh, that must have been it. Any questions on the proprioceptive system? Okay. The oral motor system is also a very powerful tool. I mean, the oral motor system is one of our primary organizers. If you think about even in utero, you'll see pictures of babies sucking their thumb, feet in the mouth. If you have a baby and a baby starts to cry, usually there's one of two things you're going to do for that infant. You're going to put something in their mouth, or you're going to rock them, right? You might do a little rock and pat. But the mouth is one of our prime organizers and continues to be one of the places that still helps us calm and regulate throughout our lifespan. There was one study that looked at some college students when they were in class, and it measured or recorded the amount of times that people put their hands near their mouth. And it's just like, it's like a centering spot. So the mouth continues to be a prime organizer for us. Like, I know if I have to choose between these two things, I'm going to choose this one because I actually like to suck through the straw. So there's tons of ways like oral motor input can be very calming throughout our lifespan. Oral motor input helps us to concentrate. I know my niece, when she was in middle school, she told me, she's like, did you know, Aunt Sharron, that at school when we're doing our state testing, we're allowed to chew gum? I think because the teacher knew that chewing gum for many kids does help them focus and to concentrate. In general, so trying to give you like some general guidelines, sucking and chewing and crunching are going to be calming. And another way to really access oral motor or respiratory is through facilitating slower, deeper breaths, right? It's really hard to say to a child when they're disorganized or if they have lower tone or some body tonal things going on to say, hey, you're upset, take a deep breath. When a child is upset or they don't have the accurate posture, what they're going to do when they take a deep breath is they're going to go, hee. And what happens, you couldn't see that here, but my stomach actually went in. My shoulders kind of went like this. When I take a nice breath, in reality, if I was to take a nice slow breath, my belly should actually expand. My shoulders should rise. My rib cage should come out. So other ways that you can do that for children who aren't quite yet able to do the take a deep breath, relax, you need to calm down, is you can facilitate blowing activities. Sometimes we'll take straws, like rubber straws, like aquarium tubing, cut it, put it into like a big bucket that's got dish soap in there and have the kids blow. We'll do blow bubble monsters. We'll do that kind of thing. We might do, I've done this a couple of times in telehealth, where we'll do cotton races where they take the straw and a cotton ball and try to move the cotton ball. I might have them make a Play-Doh maze and they're going to move the cotton ball through the maze, that sort of thing. Blow pens are fun. They're the ones that you can actually blow into and then it creates the design that way. Bubbles, of course, are fun. Think about that. So just thinking about all those fun ways that you can access breath. If you can get a child to take a nice deep exhale, they're going to have to take a nice inhale, and that inhale is going to be very calming. So just things to think about. I remember one year, I think my son was in first grade, and I told you he's very busy. Well, busy likes busy. So he was having a play date with a busy friend. And I remember calling home and asking my husband, how's it going? And he's like, I'm never having this kid over again. I'm like, well, you know, what I suggested he do is actually they were having a Nerf gun war or something, I believe. You know, take a bubble bucket, a saucepan, fill it with water and dish soap, give the kids 2 straws, and have them do a little bit of blowing. And immediately you can start to see some calming just from doing that sort of blowing exercise. Other things you can do are use water bottles with straw. And think about it, like if this straw were short, I would just have to take a little inhale, right? If this straw were long, I have to take an even bigger. Crazy straws. If I put yogurt in my straw, all the input that it has to give us. For some kids who are oral motor seekers that are constantly chewing on their shirt, constantly chewing on their finger, constantly chewing on their hair, you can get something called Chewelry on Amazon. And actually you literally type in Chewelry and they have cool like army tags or little cute little pendants that actually can go into the mouth. I think they're, what is that, PVC free or whatever. We used to have some that were pen suspenders. So the pen would go in it and it was rubber and it said brain power. And it was really cute because it also helped the kids to learn that chewing on something helps their brain to stay focused, but they pulled them whenever, I think it's PVC, I'm saying that right? Maybe. Whatever it was in that was rubber that you weren't allowed to chew on anymore. But so Chewelry is really good. And what I'll tell you here is for any sensory strategy that a child is using, if you take it away, you need to think about what they were using it for. And then if they were using it for calming, then maybe finding something to replace it with. So I had a boy once that I went into his class because he had been chewing staples and he had a hole in his cheek. And the reason he'd been chewing staples is because he'd been chewing on his shirt. So-and-so, stop chewing on your shirt. He'd been chewing on his pencil. So-and-so, stop chewing on your pencil. So by the time I got called in, he'd been chewing on his staples. So really like thinking about what are some other ways that we could accommodate for that child who really, really has a very strong oral motor need. How do we get that for them? Sometimes we'll tell parents, you know, use vibrating toothbrushes, increase the intensity and the flavors that you're having for the children, and really see how you can get that input for the kids. Some kids, you know, overstuff their mouth. Well, if you are a child who doesn't have good awareness of the mouth and you put 1 Cheerio in your mouth, you're not going to feel it. That might just swallow straight down. So you're going to be a child who needs to put 50 Cheerios in your mouth because now you're like, oh, there's my oral cavity. Now I know where my stuff is and now I can chew it. If you need tons of deep pressure input, you're not going to be a kid who does a little piece of Trident. You're going to be a kid who's like, give me 4 pieces of Hubba Bubba. That was me as a kid. Like, and I'm not going to stop chewing it until my jaws hurt, right? Because that's what the input I need. Someone had a question. And
it was Brenda saying that she has Chewelry if anybody wants it.
Oh,
so.
cool.
Thank you, Brenda.
Okay. I'm waiting. I hit the arrow key and last time I hit it in it. Oh, how do you do it here? Okay. So that's oral motor. The vestibular system is a very powerful system. The vestibular system is your movement system. It tells you if you're moving, how fast you're moving, what direction you're moving, if you're upside down, if you're right side up. The receptors are located in the inner ear. So when I move my head like this, or I move my head like this, or I go upside down, or I turn my head, or I go diagonal, my ear perceived that movement and registered it and differentiated to let me know which direction I was moving, etc. It responds to movement of the head. And kids are sneaky. If they don't like movement, they might like do a bunch of different movement, even at the park, without ever moving their head. They're going to stay in midline. So that's something we'll look at. The vestibular system is that system that if you're in your car in a parking lot and the car next to you moves, your visual system is like, you're moving, slam on your brakes. And your vestibular system is like, dude, you're not moving. You didn't move at all. Like, lay off the brakes. That's that vestibular system that lets you know if it's you're moving or something else that's, well, your visual tells you if it's something else. Your vestibular tells you if it's you. I like to think of the vestibular system as your you are here marker. The vestibular system says, here you are, and so that you can then identify where things are around you. I think that if you don't have that you are here marker, these are kids that are often like look lost in space. Like they might be kids that, let's say someone's behind me and they call my name. If my vestibular system is telling me where I am and my auditory system's working appropriately, then I can turn and locate to that sound. If my vestibular system is not giving me information about where I am and someone calls my name back here, I might do this sort of thing and finally turn to locate that person. The vestibular system allows us to know top from bottom, front from back, and left from right. And I like to think about, like, I really believe that kids have to know it in their body before they know it in space or even in language. So, you know, it's funny because we'll have kids come to us from speech therapy because, you know, they're still, I think the therapist knows that they're still not getting those prepositional phrases. And there are kids that like still like don't have an awareness of their own body. And once they get it in their body, they get it in language. And also think about it, front, back, left, right, like reversals, discrimination of letters. Is it a B? Is it a D? So a lot of times some of the work we're doing is really looking at the vestibular system. And is there something there that's contributing to that child not having that right, left awareness? The vestibular system is so important because it's the reference point for all other sensation. With the vestibular system, every system inputs into the vestibular system. The function of the vestibular system, or the movement system, again, tell us if we're moving or not moving, give us direction and speed. Here's the really interesting thing about the vestibular system, particularly for those of you who are teachers. Actually, we're all teachers right now if you have children, and this is a parent-to-parent coalition, so we're all teachers, parents. The vestibular system provides input to the attention or arousal centers in the brain. So if you have a child who needs more movement, they might be needing more movement to be able to help them focus and pay attention. So what I often recommend to parents is to provide movement opportunities frequently throughout the day, particularly before times of the day where the work is more challenging. I often have parents label the work as either red or green, where green is it's pretty easy and red is going to require a lot of cognitive control. And prior to the red input, they're doing some sort of movement break. And it's often interesting to see kids whose attention is actually increased while doing movement, while standing, while on a movement chair, that sort of thing. The vestibular system, where it's located in the brain, is actually, there's a reticular activating system that is right around the vestibular system, and that reticular activating system's job is to really feed into that arousal system. So alive, awake, alert. I like to give the example of at church moons ago, and this example stays with me. There were twins, and the dad would hold one twin, and he would kind of just do, you know, it's Catholic church, quiet. He would just do this gentle rocking for this little girl. And that's all she needed to be able to be calm and quiet throughout Mass. The other child, it was like, this child needed like massive amounts of intensity into her vestibular system to be able to get her calm. Sometimes if you think about it with your own children, some of you might have had kids that you had to put into the car seat and go for a ride for them to fall asleep. They might have had to be in the swing to fall asleep. They might have had to be in their bucket carrier on top of the washer or the dryer where it's really vibrating to fall asleep. So the vestibular input, movement input, can feed that arousal system and either upregulate it or downregulate it. I mean, think about it. Sitting in a rocking chair, for most of us, it's going to be very calming. You know, going on a spinning somehow is going to be more excitatory. So, and actually, generally that is true, but some kids might need more spinning to actually get their level of arousal to where it needs to be. So you see how it's all very individualized, but movement is super duper powerful in attention and arousal. In fact, you know, it's 7 o'clock tonight and I can't see you, so you can do whatever you want because I've taken the pictures off. But, you know, some of you might feel like you need to stand up and move while I'm talking because it's been a long day or you've been sitting or whatever, and that's all good. But you're going to find, even during this presentation, you do things to get input to your nervous system. And I'd ask you to pay attention to that. Some of it for you might just be moving your feet. You might just wiggle your feet. You might just shift positions. And as children, you know, we often need more than as adults in general. You know, as a child, you were like, oh my gosh, I'm going to go to Disneyland. I'm going to ride that ride 15 times. And now you're like, oh, I don't even want to go to Disneyland. I had a boy once that was about to get diagnosed ADHD, and he came to the clinic and we were talking, did evaluation, and I recognized that his vestibular system, he wasn't getting enough input. He wasn't registering it appropriately. So he was constantly seeking movement. He's the kid that was in the back of the classroom, standing. As they get older, they get very smart. So they might be the kid who goes to sharpen their pencil 15 times, or goes to blow their nose, or goes to the potty, or goes to the back of the classroom because they know they need that movement and they're trying to do it in a more appropriate way. But this is a kid, so we gave him a sensory diet, sensory input. He came back a couple weeks later and I was like, hey, Tyler, how are you doing? How do you like it? He goes, I hate it. Why do you hate it? He said, last year I went to Oaks Park and I rode this roller coaster 12 times and I never got dizzy. And this year I went to Oaks Park and I rode it one time and I got dizzy. And I love that example. It's so old. Tyler must be graduated from college now. He might be married with children, as some of my clients are, but he needed so much movement. Think about it. Tyler needed so much movement at Oaks Park before he could even say, oh, I just went on a roller coaster. Wow, I'm a little dizzy. Where most of us could be like one, maybe two times. That's the same kid then at school who needed so much movement to be able to focus and pay attention. So when Tyler is sitting still, I mean, most kids generally want to do well. If Tyler's sitting in his chair and his teacher, and he's trying really hard, and his teacher says, open your books to page 162, Tyler's going to be saying to himself, I need to sit still. I need to pay attention. I need to sit still. I need to pay attention. Meanwhile, he's missed that instruction. The teacher has said, open your books to page 162. He was so worried and focused on how do I sit still and pay attention that he missed all the instruction. Versus if he's allowed to be at the back of the classroom or on something that provides a little bit of movement to feed into that system, open your book to page 162, open my book to page 162, because now my arousal system is activated to the place where now I can focus and attend.
There's a question in the chat box if we have a chance.
Yeah, do you mind reading it?
Yeah, it says, could you comment on regression with oral in relation to stress?
So well, I think that's, to me, that's a simple answer. So is when we are stressed, we'll revert back to the things that are commonly calming for us. And like I said, the mouth is a very, very prime organizer. Even think about it, if you, as an adult, if you're not someone who's going to maybe go suck your shirt or suck your hair, you might start grinding your teeth. You know, you might just hold your mouth in a certain way, a posture. The mouth is a prime organizer, and I think that that's what we'll see. So we'll see regression in the sense, if I'm understanding you correctly, where they might be seeking more input into that system because it's maybe that's their powerful calming tool. Does that make sense to whoever asked the question? Okay. The other thing that the vestibular system does is it activates muscle tone and postural control. So if you're a child who's not getting enough input to that vestibular system, you might be a child, I like to call them my little Eeyores, like they're just, it's like they didn't pay their gravity bill, like kind of hunched over. And think about how that impacts social engagement too. If you don't have the adequate muscle tone to support being upright and you're more like this, you're not at the right level of even to be able to engage and attend and visually attend and auditorily pick into what was said to you. And that's also one of the reasons sometimes we see kids moving around in their chair. Sometimes you think it's about trying to get attention or arousal. And a lot of times for some kids, it might be because they're trying to find their midline. And so they're constantly moving, trying to find where they are so they don't fall out of their chair. The vestibular system, remember, it drops anchor and says, here you are. And you have to know where you are in order to know that you have a right side and you have a left side. And my right side can cross over to my left side. My left side can cross over to my right side. And I can use my right hand to write and crossing over, and I don't have to switch at midline. I can ride a bike, I can tie shoes. So the vestibular system feeds into bilateral motor coordination. And it could go into a lot of detail. We actually watched this develop in children from very, very early on. One of the primary vestibular reflexes that we see is called ATNR. So a child turns their head and their arm comes up. By a certain age, they turn their head and their arm does not come up, which allows them to bring their hands together at midline and start playing with midline. And then you'll see them start to reach across midline. And oftentimes when we do an assessment, we can see that kids are still having great difficulty with crossing midline. The other thing about the vestibular system is it's a reference for the visual system. And I love this analogy. And at some point, my audience is going to become too young that they don't understand. But the vestibular system is the tripod, if you think about it that way. And why I say that is because a lot of people don't know what a tripod is anymore. So the vestibular system is the tripod, and the visual system is the camera. So if your vestibular system is not registering appropriately and it's a little wobbly, if you will, the camera will never be stable. So we'll see kids that come to us that we might do a visual tracking exercise, and they have to move their head to track. They can't separate their head from their eyes, or they can't cross midline. They'll kind of lose it at midline, or you could just see where the eyes aren't teaming appropriately. And the work that we will do will actually be on the vestibular system. And once the vestibular pulls together, then the visual will pull together. And think about that. So I've already kind of indicated then, like, visual system's responsible for eye-hand coordination, batting a ball. It's responsible for handwriting and drawing. So, but many times if you come to me as an OT and your difficulties with writing or drawing or eye-hand coordination, I'm going to be doing vestibular work and work on the vestibular visual system, because that's where the real root of the problem is, at the bottom of the triangle. I mean, we'll still put paper and pencil to paper, but not until really that vestibular system is set and ready. Dysfunction in the vestibular system then can look like poor body and space awareness, poor spatial awareness, poor awareness of top, bottom, left, right. Oftentimes these children will have difficulties with focus and attention, poor bilateral integration. I feel like we just talked about this, difficulty with functional skills, poor muscle tone, and they might seek or avoid movement. So these might be kids that you take to the park and they don't want to play on the swing, or they'll play very briefly, or they don't like things where their feet leave the ground, or kids at the recess who are more prone to actually engage with people who are sedentary or talking, or the little child that actually wants to be near the teacher instead of engaging with the kids, because then you don't have to move. These kids often didn't like diaper changes. Diaper changes require you to turn your head back. They might not have liked tilting their head back to get their hair washed. So it's interesting where sometimes you might have thought that was a tactile difficulty. It could actually be vestibular, because that's a huge, huge vestibular input, turning your head upside down. These kids might not like being gently tossed as an infant. That might have set them off. Or on the other hand, these kids seek it, like they want it intensely. Some of the things that you can do, we talked about putting movement breaks in between and prior to learning. We'll change the seating. I'll show you some pictures. I'll show you some jobs. Now you might have kids who do movement input. So they do recess, or they go out and play, or they do whatever, and then they get so dysregulated. It's like they can't calm down. Typically, proprioceptive or heavy work, pushing, pulling, jumping, all the things we talked about first, can modulate, if you will, vestibular. So if you have a child that gets dizzy, you might tell them to push on a wall or jump up and down, because the proprioceptive input is going to help to register the vestibular and help to downregulate or modulate that input. Here are some examples of what, did someone say there was a question?
Yes.
Okay.
Is it possible then that you could get a diagnosis with hearing and sight loss when it's actually vestibular or sensory?
Loss, I wouldn't necessarily say loss. I would have to put more thought into that question. That being said, we see a ton of children with auditory processing difficulties, not hearing. Their hearing often is fine, so not hearing loss, but their auditory skills are delayed, and that could be a vestibular auditory. There's actually the vestibular, auditory, and visual systems, movement, visual, and auditory, are so intertwined. Like you almost can't separate one from the other. Similarly, the question being visual loss, I don't know that I would answer that question as a yes, but visual difficulty like tracking or eye teaming or that sort of functional skill, yes, for sure. These are some of the suggestions that you can do to change seating for children. In fact, one of the most powerful things you can do for a child who's distractible or having difficulties in the classroom is change their seating. Vestibular is so powerful. In the top left, these are little balls. You typically want the hips and the knees, she's got hers or he's got his way out here, but you want them to kind of be in a 90, 90, 90. And the way to measure that is actually from the armpit to the tip of the middle finger. And in centimeters, that's about the length of the size of the ball that you would need for a child to get them in 90, 90, 90. So balls move a lot. So here they put them in little egg crates so that they're a little more stable. Another great chair for the classroom is this one over here, this orange one. It's called a Hokie chair. It's a really good one. I think it's probably 2 or 3 years old, maybe a little bit longer than that. You see it's got this little concave, it's tilted, I'll say, bottom. So it allows for just a tiny bit of movement, not a whole lot, but a tiny bit of movement while a child is sitting on it. So what it does is it gives them their defined space. Like, here you are, here's your chair where you're supposed to be sitting, but allows them to be just doing a little bit of movement. Here's a gaming chair. So that's another good option to get a little bit of movement. Down here at the bottom middle, those are called how to hug chairs, HOWDAHUG, how to hug chairs. What they do is you can see kind of in some of these where it kind of wraps around the child. So it gives them a little bit of input. So a little bit of deep pressure, but it's also on a little bit of tilt. So it can do a little rocking. So here in this picture, the kids have, again, a very defined space about what is theirs and are allowed to do just a tiny bit of movement. This one over here is just spandex lycra material. Basically, like, we just went to the fabric store, we're basically replacing all the carpet in our clinic with vinyl because it's going to be easier to clean. Long story short, I was in a fabric store the other day, and it's swimsuit material is what we get when we use this kind of lycra material. If some of you said your children are in OT right now, you might have seen the hammocks that the kids climb in. Those are basically swimsuit material, either 3-way or 4-way stretch. And this is a daycare or preschool, I can't remember. And they just basically tied it on top of the table to create this little hammock womb space for this child who needed a little bit of deep pressure, a little bit of movement, but in a space that wasn't so busy.
I used to do that for my daughter when she was little, and that's how she would sleep.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah. And it's funny because now too, they have those tents that are the lycra for the kids. Now we're talking about vestibular here. If you're looking at the lycra for the bedding, it's more like deep pressure, but what you did is totally vestibular. Yeah. And kids love it. Love it. One of my clients just bought one for her house during COVID so she could hang it from, actually the one she bought had a frame, but you can buy them. You can just, put an eye bolt into a 2x4 and put some lycra material up, and for kids who need it. That on the right there is a balance ball, a Bosu ball. So this is a kid getting a little bit of movement and balance on a dynamic surface. Any questions on vestibular? You see how important that is? Vestibular is very, very powerful. The tactile system has receptors in the skin for light touch, pain, temperature, and pressure. The tactile system really has 2 pathways. So it has a deep touch pathway and a light touch pathway. The light touch pathway, I don't know why I'm doing this because they're in both hands actually, but the light touch pathway is more a defensive pathway. So it doesn't really tell you what touched you or where. That's the light touch. The deep touch tells you you were touched here and gives you more ability to discriminate what touched you. So a lot of times we'll see kids who are sensitive to light touch, like fabrics on their clothing, tags in their shirts, seams in their socks, but they love deep pressure. So give them deep, deep squeezes or, compressions or whatever, but not the light touch. The tactile system gives you your body boundaries, like here I am, here I end, and this is where you begin. The tactile system has a powerful effect on emotions for calming or for threat. If someone came up and touched me on my shoulder and I wasn't expecting it, it's going to be a very powerful threat as well. And it's the basis for our body image. Difficulties in the tactile system can lead to difficulties with body awareness or body boundaries. Kids might avoid messy play, so glue, sand, dirt, walking barefoot on the grass. They might be overly defensive in their approach to others. If you have a child who's sensitive to touch, sensitive to auditory, sensitive to movement, they're going to appear just more defensive in their play. And they're also, if you were defensive to all that stimuli or even one of those stimuli, you might be a child who's more controlling in your behavior because you want to protect yourself from what is to you a real threat. These kids might have difficulty with fine and gross motor skills. Again, they lost opportunities to play with some things because they were more defensive in their touch. They may seek oral input, so you can still, we do see like combinations where we'll see kids who are defensive to textures, but like seeking input in their mouth or whatever. But you also, if you are a child who seeks a ton of touch, like you're constantly touching everything, constantly touching the rug, wants to play with things really messy, always touching your neighbors, it's not uncommon that the same kid seeks oral motor input as well. So there's a lot of sensory receptors in the hand and there's a lot of sensory receptors in the mouth. And we'll often see a similar pattern where kids might be very defensive to touch and also very, very picky eaters. So, they're the kids who are only eating like white processed foods because they're very, very picky eaters.
Why is that? That's my child right there. Like she likes chewing on things. She's very, oral, but she's just really picky. And it's, you can't have her. She did a little OT for eating, and they kind of gave up on her because she won't, she'll gag, but with everything else, it's like in her mouth, but the food.
Yeah, and that's a tricky one. I'm actually not a feeding therapist. I have 2 therapists at the clinic, or actually 2 or 3 that are feeding therapists. I will tell you too, it's one of the hardest things to change. It's a very slow, not that it can't, but it's a very, very slow process. A lot of times kids get food jags, we call them, where they're only going to eat chicken nuggets, but not only eat chicken nuggets. I'm only going to eat chicken nuggets from this package.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm only going to eat it from this package that's fried in this pan with this sort of olive, whatever.
Yep.
They become such food jaggers, if you will. And so that's the first thing we have to work on, is how to break that food jag and how to get them to eat a variety of different things. And it's really slow. I'm talking about, like, let's see, a kid who only eats dinosaur chicken nuggets from the same package all the time.
That's my child.
Yeah. The first thing might be, it's going to be the tiniest shift into the bigger shifts. Yeah, I have a feeding therapist at the clinic who loves working with those kind of kids and actually has an advanced certificate in feeding. So happy to talk to you more about that. But then we see that all the time. Difficulty with visual perceptual skills. It's funny, the mouth is the first place too that we start to learn about size and shape. As an infant, I put things in my mouth. I start to learn square, round. So the tactile system also allows us to differentiate shape and size. And that's going to help us again with visual perceptual skills. Is that a B? Is that a P? Is that a D? They all look the same, but they're turned a different way. The tactile input is often calming, but you have to know the child's individual profiles. For some children, touch is not calming at all. And some kids will tell you, I've heard a teenage child say that touch to them felt like spiders crawling up and down their arm. She would identify that walking through the hallway in high school was like, she felt like everybody was walking right at her. And if anyone bumped her, she would describe it as hurting. Tactile system can be a very, very powerful contributor to dysregulation. I actually have, it's weird what the universe tells me. I think I have 3 children right now who will only wear like 1 pair of socks. Like they won't wear a variety of different socks, or won't wear underwear. Like underwear feels really bad for them. And these are, 12-ish-year-old girls that, it's going to become a real big issue here, if we're not wearing underwear. So that we're working on that. You might look at, does the child want deep pressure versus light pressure? Do they like deep hugs versus light hugs? I'll show you dots and squeezes. Soft fabrics. I had a little boy one time when he came home from school, he loved to play with his little stuffed cat. And that was what he would do to calm. And so what his mom did is took him and the cat to the fabric store, let him, Josiah, pick out a fabric that he really liked. And then they put it on a carabiner, and then he was allowed to take it to school with him so that he had that little swatch of that fabric to be able to use when he needed it. Another little girl really loved corduroy. And so her mom did the same thing and put it on a little carabiner, and she had the fabric to use. And what that did then is, this is a little girl that at circle time was always touching her neighbors and always touching her peers. Well, now she had the fabric to touch instead. For some kids, when we're playing games, if I'm sitting at a desk, they're the kids that when it's not their turn are like touching everything. What we might do is put a Velcro sticky, double sticky back Velcro under the desk, so that we'll remind them when it's not your turn, you can fidget with that. So it just gives them a little different texture that they can use to play with when it's not their turn, but stay seated. Or many of you know about fidgets. There's a variety of different, thinking putty, smart putty, variety of different sensory bins, that sort of thing. Auditory, you'll see kids covering their ears, noticing every sound. I'm working with a little girl in telehealth right now, and she's autistic, and she's 3. And it's funny because I work with her every Thursday, and every Thursday she's been telling me about the lawnmower. And then what will happen is, because the neighbors have someone come and mow their lawn every Thursday. I mean, I know in my session with her, someone's gonna come mow the lawn. And at first it was just kind of cute. Like, oh, she's recognized that someone's coming to mow the lawn. And by last week, I said to the mom, do you think it's because she doesn't, like she stops. So like we'll be having this wonderful engagement, and then the neighbor will come and mow the yard, and she now has to go and watch this neighbor mow the yard. And I'm wondering if she's more sensitive to it. Like, so she needs to know where that lawnmower is and where it's going so she feels safe. Lower frequency sounds like lawnmowers, vacuum cleaners, toilets flushing, blenders, those low frequency sounds travel a great distance. Like you can hear them far away, but they don't tell you where they're coming from. So if you have a child who also maybe doesn't have good body awareness, and now you have this low frequency sound, for them, it often sounds like it's right on top of them. And so we will see kids who have to watch that sound to maybe feel a little more in control, or they're going to get away. Auditory dysfunction, we might see kids who don't respond, even though they have normal hearing. You know, you call their name, and they don't tune into that. Difficulty following directions. You know, you might have a child that in a one-to-one classroom or in a one-to-one environment does very, very well, but as soon as the environment gets more complex or there becomes more people, their behavior sort of disintegrates, or they're not as regulated. These kids might just adamantly refuse to participate in noisy environments. They might display fight, flight, or freeze responses. And you'll see that to any system. If you're having a defensive response or you're sensitive to those stimuli, it's likely that you're going to have a fight, a flight, or a freeze response. That's what sensory defensive is. So what can you do is be aware of the environment. So, you know, if a child keeps turning away, you might wonder, like, take a peek and listen yourself and see what's going on. Be aware of auditory difficulties as an antecedent. Little boy that I used to work with, I got called into the classroom because every time it was time to clean up, he avoided cleaning up, was disobedient, and didn't help, or whatever. That's the connotation, right? So what I knew about this little boy is he was very auditorily sensitive. So go into the classroom, do a classroom observation, and he's playing very nicely with peers. Teacher says, okay, we're going to clean up in 5 minutes. Well, this little boy bolts right into a cubby, and he's hiding in a cubby. And so I could see where the teacher's like, oh, he's being disobedient. Doesn't want to clean up. It's his responsibility to clean up too. Well, what happens when then 5 minutes go by is she rings a bell. And as soon as she starts to ring the bell, he closes his ears. It's like, aha, that's what's happening. So, you know, could he hold the bell? Could he be near you when you ring the bell so that he knows when it's coming? All those sorts of things. So being aware of what might be an antecedent. In general, music with a defined rhythm and a beat will facilitate movement. Basically, like any Disney soundtrack is going to be really good if you have a child who you want to really get at movement for, because they're either low tone or they have clumsy, whatever, and you want to facilitate movement. In general, in a classroom or for homework, for attention and organization, Mozart and Baroque are going to be good choices. Vivaldi, they're at a characteristic 50 to 70 beats per minute, and that really is going to get at attention and focus. There's tons of books about that, Mozart effect, etc. These kids, I won't spend too long for you guys, I know you know this, you might ask them to repeat what you said, or even if they're very, very bright, if they're, you know, a child who's in a complex auditory environment might be missing details, you might say first, then. Okay, we're kind of going to shift gears a little bit now and start to talk about behavior and some top-down strategies. We've talked a little bit about, or for this time that I've been talking now, about giving input to the nervous system and supporting the sensory systems that way. Now I'm going to talk to you about maybe giving some top-down strategies. So I love this graph. So if you look at this graph, you see the optimal level of arousal. And it's basically, I think you can see where did my mouse go? There we go. Between this line, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, between that line and that line is the optimal level of arousal. So in the optimal level of arousal is where learning, engagement, social communication, academics, all that is going to be able to take place because you're in the optimal level of arousal. And we spend most of our day there, right? Although it's been very trying times, but we spend most of our day in this optimal level of arousal. We might get up in the morning, I know I need my cup of tea, or I might need a walk, or whatever I need to do. Even though I've woken up a little more tired, I do whatever I need to do to get my energy level just right. I might sink down at some point during the day, and then I might say, oh, I'm gonna go get a little fresh air, and then I go back up. Or then something might happen where right about here, who knows, maybe I'm leaving work, I just got home, and it's like, oh my gosh, what am I going to make for dinner? Blah, blah, blah. I start to get a little stressed. I'm like, oh, never mind. I pulled out the chicken, whatever. You know, we do this all day. Oh, and then now it's bedtime. And I don't know why my husband doesn't know that I really am very anal about when kids go to bed and would love a little bit of help. I don't know. So now I start to get even more stressed. And then I come back down. Like we do that all day, every day, right? And our window's pretty big. We mostly stay in the optimal level of arousal, I hope. What happens for some of our kids is you might have a kid who's more generally low arousal. So these triangles are sensory events, and here's a big sensory event. And really, no matter what the sensory event is for this child who's low arousal, they very rarely get up to the level of being able to engage. I mean, they're just like, you know, again, they're these Eeyores. They're very, you know, they're the last one to move. You want to light 10 sticks of dynamite underneath them. You know, they just really low energy, really low affect, really low arousal. Also, you could have a child who's very overstimulated. This A, like they live in shutdown. Oftentimes, low arousal and shutdown look very, very similar. It's tricky, but again, not engaging, very overwhelmed. What happens with our kids with sensory processing disorder, or maybe more sensory defensive, is they might start off okay, and then you didn't wash their pair of jeans that they really like, and so they're not as mushy, or you did wash them, or you didn't, who cares? You know, they're not the way they usually feel for them. So they're not mushy, or they're not hard enough, whatever it is, and they start to get a little overstimulated. And then they go to school, and why did the teacher change the desk of where I'm sitting? Because you know I hate change, but you did it anyway. And then I went to lunch, and I might have got a little bit more into here, but then we went to recess, and then, you know, so-and-so accidentally bumped me, and I'm sort of teetering on the edge here. And now I get home, and you say, Johnny, put away your shoes. You know, you put away your shoes when you come home. And this is the hour from hell, the witching hour. I'm a hostage in my own home. So this is the hour now where typically it's 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, when everyone's sort of transitioning. The child can't take it anymore. They have tried so hard all day at school to pull themselves together, and I just can't do it anymore. So, you know, it's interesting, kind of goes back to the face mask question, right, Brenda? So that's a sensory event. And in typical circumstances, our bandwidth is about right here, and we can handle all that. But when there's a lot of stress, either external or sensory or whatever's happening, our band, I gotta see, I've gotta make sure you guys can see me. That band gets lowered. So where it used to be here is now here. So what I used to be able to handle, I can't handle. Or for our kids with sensory processing disorder, where our bands are like here, theirs is already here. So every little sensory stimuli tips them over the edge. So what our job then is, as paraprofessionals, as people working with these kids, as parents working with these kids, is to help decrease their sensory defensiveness and to put sensory supports in throughout the day so that those little sensory events don't become so big, so that they're supported where their optimal level of arousal might go from being very, very narrow to broadening that level of optimal level of arousal, where there's more window in here for things to happen. And the way we're going to do that, again, is by decreasing sensory defensiveness and putting sensory supports in throughout the day. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
One of the things that we're going to look at is the Just Right challenge. And so this is a very similar graph to the one that I just showed. A child's capacity to learn is going to be at that optimal challenge. That's where you're going to see interest, curiosity, and engagement. But then as a child starts to feel more fear or anxiety or overwhelmed, you're going to need to decrease the stimulation. Where on the other hand, if a child is more like bored, apathetic, decreased interest, you might need to increase the stimulation. The point of this is there's this optimal level of there's this just right challenge, and OTs are always looking at that. So we might do a task, and for Johnny, we need to do it this way because that's the optimal level for him. But for Ricky, we need to do it a different way because that's the optimal level for him. Even though it's the same task, there's some modification to make it the just right challenge. And I'm often telling kids, we can't make it too easy, because what happens when it's too easy, remember I talked about that optimal level of arousal? There's only one, and remember I said for kids with sensory processing disorder, their band is pretty narrow versus ours. So if yours is narrow and the way to broaden it is you have to bump up on the edges, right? So you can't just stay in this comfortable zone. You kind of have to find that just right challenge where you're just kind of tipping on it or tipping on this edge so that it gets broadened. So does that make sense? Because oftentimes we'll see, sometimes we're even as therapists, we're too afraid to bump up on those edges, but you have to, or because that's where the growth is going to occur. And I don't mean no pain, no gain. I'm not talking that at all. I'm talking very gently bumping up against it. And so that expands. And the way to actually bump up against it is to find that just right challenge. It can't be too easy. It's too easy, there's no growth. If it's too hard, they're not going to want to do it, and there'll be no engagement and nothing's going to happen. So you have to find that just right. So an example might be a parent wants me to work on shoe tying with a child. So my first question I'm going to ask is it developmentally appropriate? Yeah, he's 8 years old, totally developmentally appropriate to work on shoe tying. So now I need to look at the unique strengths and weaknesses of this child. So they have visual deficits. They actually have some tone deficits where they can't actually reach down and grab their feet. I might need to make an adaptation that way. Finger dexterity, whatever. Actually, regulation, I might look at regulation too. Oh, genius. Look at regulation. So if I'm working on shoe tying, it might be appropriate that I'm working on it in a smaller room where this child does a really nice job because there's less external stimuli that's distracting them, versus if I say, okay, we're going to work on it in the waiting room as we're transitioning out. Well, now we didn't want to transition and it's very loud in the waiting room. I'm going to get a different level of response from this child. So I'm constantly looking at how do I adapt the task to make it just right. And it's going to be based on where their regulation level is as well. So we're going to look at strategies then to promote the optimal level of arousal, self-regulation, and behavioral organization. And for each child, it's going to be different. We're going to look at what's happening first. Some kids are going to need more novelty to pique their interest. And then a lot of the kids with sensory processing disorder really need consistency. You want to have a clear beginning and an end to your sensory strategies. You're going to review it often. Is it still working? Is it not working? Do I need to adapt it? Is it still the just right challenge? And then with sensory strategies, one of the most common things you need to look at for each child, and one of the ways that you can make it a just right challenge, is by changing the intensity, the frequency, or the duration. And here's a great picture of it. So you see this picture on the left. You have 3 boys, and they really wanted to play with each other. I mean, they were really driven socially to play with each other. The kid on the bottom, this is his just right challenge. He does not have good balance. He does not like moving on suspended equipment. You can see here, he's hunkered down. He's kind of bent over. He's like, this is all I can take. That is my just right challenge. If I were to say, no, you have to stand on the swing, forget it. That's too hard, right? So, and if I just let him sit on the side, he wouldn't have, then again, it's not going to change anything. I didn't have to say anything because he's driven by his peers here, which is awesome. The second kid is standing up. So for him, you can see he's kind of postured where he's like still kind of holding on. It's still needing a little bit more support. That's the just right challenge for him. This little guy is like, how the heck do I get into the rafters? Like, I want to climb the ceiling. And he's actually literally, I think we have a video of these guys, and he's like, faster, higher, faster. And this guy's like, slow down, slow down. So really looking at the frequency, intensity, and duration of the input you're giving. This young man over here, we started playing shaving cream. He has autism. He does not make very good eye contact. He's not often engaged until he gets the right level of input to get to engaged. So I put out some shaving cream and we were going to just play in shaving cream. Well, I don't know what I was thinking. I knew this little boy loved input. I don't even think this is the final picture. There's probably one with it in his hair. I mean, it's literally all over his body. But where I zoomed in on this picture is when he got that much shaving cream and that much intensity is where now we have engagement, where now we have eye contact. It's different for him than it would be for somebody else. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Many of you have probably seen the zones of regulation. One of the things I talk about is at some point, and often very early on, it's very nice to start talking to children about their emotions. And so we can do it in a very kind of subtle way, if you will, for kids beginning at like even preschool. We might talk about blue zone, green zone, yellow zone, red zone, where red is like angry and mad and terrified. And yellow is kind of like anxious, maybe excited, not quite red, not quite stop, but it's not also green, where green is like calm, ready to learn, good, proud. And then blue being more bored, tired. I'm finding that a lot of teachers are using this in their classroom. What I'm also seeing is that I've heard a couple times that teachers now are teaching the families on Zoom, which is interesting because I was working with a little girl, 3rd grade, and I started trying to teach her zones. And she's like, yeah, I know that. My teacher does it. But it hadn't been given to the mom. So there wasn't that that communication to the parents of what they were also working on, which would have helped to solidify that. And that's one of the things I talk about when we're working with families and working with children, is having a common language. So we might all be using the zones of regulation, or we might all be using how does your engine run? Too low, just right, too high. So I might tell kids, hey, your body's like a car, and a car can go too low, too slow. Like when you're tired, or I just did the wrong affect. Like when you're tired or bored, it can go too high, like when you're going really fast or really, really angry or really, really excited, and it can be just right. Very young, you can start to teach kids that. And just starting to get them to label, because if they can't label, they can't change. And then we might move into things like a 5-point scale. And this is interesting too. I think as parents, it's really important to know those 5 points for your children's behavior. So the sensory strategy you're going to put in, I think it's important to know what their triggers are, what a 3 looks like for your child. Does a 3 look like turning away, refusing, disengaging? What does a 4 look like? Are they starting to throw toys? Are they starting to scream? Is their voice getting more whiny? What does a 5 look like? 5's gone. Kids are gone. There's no reason to put a sensory tool in at a 5. The 5, the child is disconnected from their cortex. What does a 2 look like? You know, what does calm look like? And then what you do is you start putting sensory strategies in at a 2, in at a 3. Again, by a 5, you're holding space, finding somewhere safe, you know, so that you're getting less chances of the child getting to a 4. 4, you can still put strategies in. What do I do when my child hits a 4? So you as parents, depending on your child, might be identifying the 5 points, or with your child, you might be talking about it and using that. So some of the ways that we can start to use top-down strategies. These are 5-point scales. Again, if you go to Pinterest, actually one of my therapists, Laura Levine at lauralevine.com, Pinterest, she has a ton of cool scales that she's used, using very common things like Angry Birds or marbles or superheroes. Nobody knows about Eeyore, Pooh, or Tigger anymore, sadly. Kids with sensory processing disorder love routine. They love to know what their schedule is. They love to know what is coming next. And for instance, my son, when he was little, he always, especially if it was a no school day, he wanted a picture schedule of what he was going to do. And he's a very bright boy, but he just needed to know. And if it was a Sunday and we were going to dinner at my mom's, who's going to be there? So I might have to put, you know, blah, 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 dinner at Mimi's. Who's going to be there, just so he knew. Especially if you're more anxious or more sensory defensive, you need that feeling of control, like what's going to happen, what's coming next, who's going to be there. Some kids, you know, most classes now have that on their teacher's board. Some kids need it on their desk. Some kids might have the teachers on the classroom, but then have a first then on their desk. So this has book, Play-Doh, lunch. The child's just has book, Play-Doh. Usually the then is a preferred object. So probably in this example of book then Play-Doh, Play-Doh was something that we knew the kid would like. You might also talk about prior expectations. So, hey, my family, my husband was raised by a military colonel. He thinks our children should sit down at the table for longer than I think they should sit at the table, but that's okay. So we meet in the middle. And so for my kids, even now, you know, and actually my son now will say, Mom, you're talking your OT stuff, but you know, whatever. So at dinner, you know, this is what we're going to do. This is the expectation. You're going to share about your day. You're going to try all the foods or a piece of all the food, and you're going to sit in your chair. You might even put, you're going to sit in your chair for 10 minutes, whatever, you know, your expectations are, and then let the kids see it. You might tie it to whatever incentive at the end, dessert, whatever, a playtime with you, whatever. But really, sometimes all you have to do for kids is do points. So you see here, it says points. So every time I catch you trying a bite of a food, or if I see you sitting in your chair, I'm going to give you a point. And then they love this idea of getting points. So they might work for that. Today I was playing with a little boy, and I was giving him, we had an image of a shark and a fish. And every time I caught him having, listening ears or having a flexible brain, doing what I want to do, I moved a fish into the shark's mouth. And he just loved watching that incentive happen right away, that immediate feedback. You might talk about at recess. Some kids at school, what I see a lot is at the end of the day, they get a smiley face or a sad face, which actually makes me very sad, because a lot of our kids, it's likely they're going to get a sad face at the end of the day most often. What we often will do is then talk to parents and teachers about having a check in and check out. So you're going to recess. We're going to check in. Hey, buddy, remember, you're going to recess. I want you to have a safe body. That means no hitting. I want you to have friendly words, which, might be saying nice job or great work. And I want you to have fun. So you might give them points, you might not. They go out to recess, they do their thing. Immediately after recess, you come back. Hey, how'd you do? Did you have a safe body? Yes. Did you have friendly words? Yes. Oh, good job. So immediately, kids that usually, might have it at the end of the day, you might do it at reading time. You might do it at transition. So this is our plan. This is what it's going to look like. I'm going to remind you, check in. You're going to do it. We're going to check out. So real quick. And it has to be very concrete. In fact, safe body might not even be concrete enough. It might need to be no hitting, etc. The other thing I think that is helpful is to use this approach called PACE, which is being playful, accepting, curious, and empathetic. There's a YouTube video here that, again, my colleague Laura Levine put on for how to use PACE. But this might be a child who, the other day, for instance, in telehealth, one of my little boys, when I got to the session, something had happened. Oh, he'd hit his brother. And, the parents were upset. This has been happening a lot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So come in like, oh, man, you were playing cars with your brother and Sammy got hurt. Whew, kind of accepting, not really judging. And then he might not say anything. And I wonder why, curious. I wonder why when Sammy's playing with you and he's doing something you like, you might hit him. I wonder. Just kind of asking, like making some guesses. I often say I'm going to put my Curious George hat on, and then being empathetic. But then you can often get the story from the child of like what the real reason behind their behavior is. And oftentimes it's not what you thought it was. There's usually some reason. Well, Sammy wasn't taking my idea. So I wanted him to play with the train this way and he was playing it with it that way, and that made me angry. And they'll begin to give you the narrative. So any questions about any of that? My summary is to be a detective, be very curious. Kids with sensory processing disorder need lots of visuals. Reinforce appropriate behavior. We find ourselves with these kids who are more challenging, being constantly sort of focusing on the negative because that's what's in our face. There's a book I love called The Nurtured Heart Approach, where in that book, you're really, really reinforcing the appropriate behavior. And sometimes I'll even read like How to Fill a Bucket. Some of you may have heard that. And I'll have a literal bucket with like pom-poms for the kids. Wow, nice job taking your brother's idea. Or I love the way you put your shoes in the closet without me asking, and really reinforcing that appropriate behavior. Use engine language so that you're really starting to talk to the children about their nervous system, either being too high, too low, just right, 5 point, whatever. And be very clear and consistent in your expectations. Parents are often asking me, is it sensory or is it behavior? And how do I parent it if it's sensory versus if it's behavior? And either way, I do think kids do need consequences for their behavior, but most importantly, you need to be clear and consistent in your expectations. Play and emotional connection is primary importance, and then forgive yourselves. We're going to make mistakes. And to me, it's part of like, when I try an approach with a child in the clinic and it didn't work out the way I thought it would, then I might just say, oh, that was like a trial. That didn't work. And like, why might that have not worked, and try something different next time. You've seen that one. That's the public service announcement right now during COVID, and really talking about not being too hard on yourself. And what, especially right now where we're having to be parents and teachers and everything for the kids, and the kids are struggling as much as we are. About 3 weeks ago in telehealth, my whole team started to say, like, kids would start to say random things. One child started misbehaving in therapy, and misbehaving is a big word, right? And, we're wondering, what's happening here? And finally he said, I am not listening to you or talking to you until I can get back in the clinic, which opened up this whole ability to then be empathetic and like, oh yeah, right. This is really, really hard. And then he could open up like, yes, he hates this. This is like, is it ever going to end? And so in the end, when you have to pick, because at some point you will, where you're going to divide your attention, choose connection. Pick playing a game over arguing about an academic assignment. Pick teaching your child to do laundry rather than feeling frustrated that they aren't helping. Pick laughing, snuggling, and reminding them that they are safe. So I think that goes in all times. Connection and engagement are so powerful, and you'll be able to get so far with that. I can have therapists that have striking resumes and years of experience, but if they can't connect with a child, you're not going to get anywhere. Is there any questions? That was a lot of me talking. I'm happy to answer any questions.
What is the process if you're a parent and you're or you're a teacher and you feel like a child is struggling with some sensory needs? What is the process of getting them a diagnosis and getting them help?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So right now, there's no real diagnosis of sensory processing disorder. Like there's a manual that we use for diagnoses like autism, cerebral palsy, fetal alcohol, whatever. It's called the DSM. And sensory processing disorder got very close to being in the latest edition of the DSM-5, but it didn't make it. So there's no real official diagnosis of sensory processing disorder. And that being said, most physicians now, most pediatricians are aware of it. So where do if a child is at like Evergreen Pediatrics, they refer quite easily, or, Miller Pediatrics, there's certain places that are very familiar with sensory processing disorder. I would just ask for a referral to an OT clinic that works with sensory processing disorder, and your pediatrician should know where to get that.
So you're able, if the pediatrician gives you a referral to the OT, it's more streamlined than it would be like, let's say, getting an autism diagnosis.
Yeah, it's even faster than that. Some insurance companies don't even require a physician referral. In fact, many do not require a physician referral to OT. So like if you were to call my clinic, then I know my office manager would know right away if yours required a physician referral. Most don't. There's a couple that do.
Is it ever too late?
That's a good question. No, it's not ever too late. So like I said, I have a couple peers who love working with adults. When I started in 0 to 3. I was at VCTC, Innovative Services at that point. I mean, actually it was VCTC then. And it was 0 to 3 and some 3 to 5. And I remember then at that point, that was 97. It was just starting to be the decade of the brain, where at that point, people were still saying it had to be in from 0 to 3, or 0 to 5. And I will tell you that change happens really fast there, right? But I was leaving there and I was going to a private practice and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to hate this. Like these kids can talk to me. My 0 to 3 is like, pick them up, put them on a swing, move them. I love the older kids because they will tell you exactly, what they're feeling, what they're doing, what the input feels like. Sometimes we start to get kids who at older ages start to have learned behaviors that are a little bit harder to resolve. But no, we used to see, I would tell you our primary population was like 7 to 9-year-old boy. We have a lot of 11 to 14 now. And I do see some older kids. The older kids I'll often put with my more experienced therapist because there's just a lot more emotional stuff there. And oftentimes I will ask the parent, does the child want to be here? Like if you're talking about a 16-year-old grumpy kid, I don't need any more kids flicking off their parents in my session.
Okay. I'm going to stop the recording in case anybody's being shy about asking and recording. So I'll do that right now.
Thank you. I forgot about that.